With a patient and caring teacher, the spirit of the dance will become a part of this boy. In just the same way, the spirit of his culture has been impressed upon him from the moment of his birth. The human personality, rich, varied, fascinating. How does it come into being? How do we become who we are, each with a distinctive way of thinking, feeling, and behaving? What turns us from a helpless child into a well-defined adult who is a functioning member of a particular culture? Our personalities are, in fact, shaped and molded by the culture we live in. Guided one way, prodded another. Much of what we are is learned from parents, teachers, and other important people in our lives who tell us what to be and how to think. Inside this warrior lies Anand, the Balinese boy. It is his culture that sets and defines the limits of his performance and his personality. Uncovering these links between culture and personality has been a major concern of anthropologists for the past 50 years. A connection marveled at by many before them. O body swayed to music, O brightening glance. How can we know the dancer from the dance? The integration of culture and personality begins in early childhood. Through the process of enculturation, the personality requirements of each society are transmitted from one generation to the next. Cultural attitudes are often transmitted without specific direction. Yet, through observation and example, we become every inch a member of our particular society. But the process of enculturation is not always so subtle. What this young boy undergoes to enter this Tibetan Buddhist monastery is a dramatic demonstration of the more explicit elements of enculturation. He lives in a community where every fifth male becomes a monk, where all activities and experiences are seen as having a spiritual dimension and significance. At this tender age, his behavior is shaped to that of the group. This boy will have a teacher or guru to instruct him. From this honored teacher, he will learn the forms of meditation, the forms of reverence, even the forms of debate that are an important part of monastic life, and valued in the rest of the society as well. All these experiences will mold him into a certain kind of personality, and thus he will become a Buddhist monk, the ideal of Tibetan culture. In the 1920s and 30s, documenting the complex process of enculturation was the central work of a small group of anthropologists, including Margaret Mead, who studied cross-cultural patterns of child rearing. Mead's research in Samoa led her to the conclusion that adolescence there was not characterized by tension and rebellion as it is in the United States, because Samoan culture is more casual about sexual maturation, casual about the facts of birth, life, and death. Boys and girls spend many playful hours together, and sexuality is not hedged about in secrecy. Much of Samoan behavior Mead traced to the strictness or looseness of child-rearing practices, which she studied as well in the New Guinea tribes like the Arapesh, the Mundugamo, and the Chambuli. Mead's observations in these cultures led her to conclude that sex roles were not solely biologically determined, but were culturally learned. Her work helped change our whole view of male and female behavior and made us realize to what extent we are all a product of cultural prescriptions. Controversy now surrounds Margaret Mead. Nevertheless, along with Ruth Benedict and others, Margaret Mead helped pioneer the field of psychological anthropology. The terror of World War II provided further impetus to the field of psychological anthropology. Both psychologists and anthropologists conducted studies aimed at understanding national character, typical personality traits associated with a culture. If we could better understand the character of our enemies, perhaps we could anticipate their behavior. The psychologist Erik Erikson wrote about German aggression, political immaturity, and racial prejudice. He said, the Germans looked upon the world as a treacherous, encircling encampment of enemies living for one aim, namely the betrayal of Germany. Such a characterization of Germans seemed simplistic and did not allow for the wide range of differences within the culture. And many of the traits supposedly found in Germans could also be identified in people of other nationalities as well. Ironically, the greatest atrocities in the world were performed by people who themselves believed in and acted upon vicious stereotypes of national character. The behavior of Germany's World War II ally, Japan, seemed to Americans even less comprehensible than did that of the Germans, especially when Japanese kamikaze pilots engaged in suicidal air attacks on U.S. ships. Honored by their emperor and great heroes to the Japanese people, these pilots of the divine wind were, by Western standards, incomprehensible. Yet they came by the hundreds. In an attempt to understand the culture that would produce such behavior, anthropologist Ruth Benedict was commissioned by the U.S. government to do a wartime study of the Japanese. Her book, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, recognized and tried to put into proper cultural context the apparent contradictions in Japanese behavior. But her work and other wartime studies were flawed by lack of field work and direct observation. It was only after the war that a richer and more complex view of the national character in Japan was possible. It falls, the peony. Upon each other lie petals, 2 or 3. The poem is haiku, an art practiced in Japan since the beginning of the 13th century. Like the ancient tea ceremony, haiku is meant to recreate feelings that lead one to the deepest harmony with nature. The thousands of stylized symbolic motions associated with making tea express a belief that the human being is refreshed and recreated through aesthetic rituals. In silence, in repose, the individual achieves inner peace. How can we reconcile violent self-destruction with the calm peacefulness of these practices? Haiku, the tea ceremony, karate, even the kamikaze are all part of a belief in humility, in respect for tradition, and obedience to a benevolent father figure. In a deeply patriarchal society, great respect and deference is accorded to the father, the carrier of the family's tradition and representative of a long line of revered ancestors. Anthropologists now see kinship relations as the psychological heart of Japanese society and the key to a study of their national character. Wherever one's primary emotions lie, there one is likely to find the center of personality. Life in Japan has changed dramatically over the last 50 years. Village life has given way to an industrialized urban Japan. This change has, to a certain extent, separated them from their ancient traditions. Nevertheless, the Japanese cling to their familial ties, now often expressed through paternalistic institutions. Whether it is the father, the policeman, or the emperor, all Japanese life revolves around loyalty and deference to a number of father figures. Today, much of Japanese life is controlled by corporations which arrange housing, guarantee employment, deal with the psychological problems of their employees, and even provide entertainment. Overseeing the welfare of the Japanese worker is the boss, who acts as a substitute father.
今日は皆さん非常に明るい顔をしておられるので、このようにいつも明るいいただいても本当に心強く感じるものでございます。さて今日も一日仕事にかかるにあたりまして、一言朝の挨拶をしたいと存じます。私が時々申し上げます通り、すでにアメ横精神を持ってより以上努力してほしい。アメ横精神とは言うまでもなく、いつも私が申し上げる通りに、この廃墟の中から立ち上がった非常にこの根強い根性といいましょうか、そのような面で常に時代の先端を行く考え方を持って現在までこの立ち上がってきておる。ぜひ今日一日も、よりよく明るく良い接客態度でより以上協力を望みたい。社員10君、当社社員であることに誇りを持ち団結して明朗に勤務いたしましょう。業者会議であることに誇りを持ち、団結して明朗に勤務いたしましょう。容姿は大切です。皆にお勤め、真面目で快楽な態度を持ってお客様に接しましょう。容姿は大切です。皆にお勤め、真面目で快楽な態度を持ってお客様に接しましょう。人が偏ることなく常に忠誠恩恵を旨といたしましょう。人が偏ることなく常に忠誠恩恵を旨といたしましょう。では今日も一日無事故でしっかりやりましょう。
This corporation is trying to get people to work more effectively together and release their tensions. Such behavior would be almost unthinkable in the U.S. This young girl has just graduated from a local school and will now leave home to continue her education elsewhere. Saying goodbye is hard no matter where you live, but the family ties symbolized by these ribbons are much stronger in Japan than they are for most Americans. Perhaps our own ribbons would be fewer and of another color, but the underlying feelings of loss and loneliness would surely be the same. Can we say that there is something specifically Japanese about the Japanese personality? Are they more alike as people than they are different? The answer is a qualified yes, but exactly how alike is difficult to measure. In an effort to provide a deeper understanding of national character, psychological anthropologists have recently focused on what they call the core values of a culture. A comparison of Chinese and American core values has been done by Francis L.K. Hsu, a leader in this field. According to Hsu, the Chinese value kinship and the cooperation associated with it. This is their core value. Self-reliance is not an ideal. It is neither promoted, nor is it a matter of pride. Mutual dependence is the very essence of personal relationships here, and has been for thousands of years. The revolutionary movement of the 1940s in the form of Mao's communism expressed this value anew. Compliance and subordination of the will of an individual to that of the family kinship group is a fundamental Chinese belief. Not surprisingly, Mao Zedong and his revolutionary movement sought to expand the Chinese notion of the family to include the entire nation, with himself as the father. The explicit political content of this children's dance has been dictated by the government. Finally, all work, all play, leads to that one great work, that of the nation as a whole. According to the I Ching, a book of ancient Chinese sayings, holding together brings good fortune. What is required is that we unite with others in order that all may complement and aid one another through holding together.
Gotta get to the world off of my back. Oh, pretty soon I'm gonna crack. I get in my truck, I drive that damn thing as fast as I want to. If I want to back it up the highway, I'm the one that pays the fine if I break the law. So, no, I'm independent. I like being independent. It's best to be free and outside, where you can do what you want to do when you want to, wake up when you want to, sleep when you want to, as long as you get the job done that you set up for yourself. So I gotta get the world off of my back.
In the United States, the core value is a belief in rugged individualism. The single individual can achieve anything he or she likes if that person tries hard enough. That is the American ideal of character. It is probably the source of the many great accomplishments of the society. This view makes us exuberant, creative, restless, always on the move. Whether in individual or in team sports, competition and winning are crucial.
What we gotta do is you gotta swing that bat. We need hits. We need lots of hits. Whatever you do, don't throw the ball around. Just make sure you got to play before you throw it. If you got to dive for a ball to stop it, dive for it. You got to keep them from scoring. That's the name of the game.
We score runs and keep them from scoring. I want to see a lot of hustle out there. I want to see a lot of hollering, a lot of screaming, a lot of...
What's out there? Come on, Jimmy. Okay, Jim, get him now. Get him now.
The pressure to excel in the United States is relentless, and many children learn at an early age that the better they are at competitive sports, the more their parents will love them, and the more popular they will be with peers.
You got him.
Jeffrey, get the glove down. Come on, let's go. Go on. Hold! Out there. Hey, hold it! Come on! Off the field. What's the mission we knock about shirt? Off the field. Try to throw you now.
Ali Marshall. Take the lowest C.
In the West, marriage ties are based on unpredictable romantic love. The singularity of that bond puts enormous pressure on the institution of marriage. Nearly 1/2 of American marriages end in divorce.
The lowest C.
In most other cultures, however, it is the more stable kin group that provides the loving bonds that make life possible.
According to God's word.
A man down in Texas heard Pat in the radio mention the fact that our 2 youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Check. And you know, regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
Because of the precariousness of affections in the United States, people displace many of their emotions onto pets. Our obsession with individualism accounts for considerable psychological pain. Independence brings insecurity and causes people to look for love in their pets, children who will never grow up.
My dog's name is Princess, and she was a boxer, and we raised her since she was a puppy. And when the day came when she died, we decided to bury her in a pet cemetery because we felt that she was part of the family. We treated her like she was my sister, and my mom and dad treated her like she was her daughter. And we come often as we can, especially on holidays like Christmas, Halloween, Easter, and her birthday. The day she died, she was a good dog. She was like a sister. We all loved her. We miss her so much. I love her.
Different cultures produce different types of people. In the early days of our own country, self-reliance was an essential characteristic of the pioneer. Today, it continues to fit well with the needs of an industrial society of small, highly mobile families. The ideal of freedom from any kind of personal constraint is both a source of greatness and a source of psychological pain. Independent can translate into alone and individualistic into selfish. There is no challenge greater than understanding the human personality. Within any single culture, individual differences are great, and no one person fits neatly into a single psychological profile. Yet there are great similarities between the people of any one culture, and they helped create the richness and uniqueness of that culture. In the end, we can never separate the dancer from the dance. We can only learn to respect how precious and unique our separate cultures and personalities are, and to cherish that being we call a person.